Preston Hale shoved Claire into the observation room and locked the door from the inside. 1 second. No warning. Preston Hale, Chief of Medicine, Mercy Ridge Medical Center. Claire's back was already against the wall. Her scrubs were still damp from the last shift. Her name badge was crooked. Her hands, the hands that had held IV lines and checked pulses and written 12-hour charts without shaking, were completely still at her sides. Because if they moved, he would see it. He was 4 inches from her face. The door was locked. The glass was soundproof. The hallway outside was empty. There was no one left to call. 6 days earlier, on a Tuesday morning, her father's oldest friend had pressed a steel ring into her palm at a kitchen table in Bridgeport and said one sentence. Her father had taught her this when she was 9 years old. A pattern, a rhythm, the kind of language that travels through walls when your voice cannot. Her hand found the glass. She couldn't stop the shaking. She tapped anyway. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. On the other side of that glass, 41 feet away, Wade Calloway stopped mid-step. What he did next left that hospital changed forever. This is Heart Tales. Here's the full story. The lock clicked once. That was the only sound in the room. Preston didn't move toward her right away. That was the part that made it worse. He stood with his back against the door and looked at her the way man looks at something he has already decided about. Unhurried. Certain. The particular stillness of someone who has thought this through and arrived at the conclusion that there is nothing left to negotiate. Claire counted the distance between them. 8 feet. She counted the glass panels. 3 sides. Floor to ceiling. The family waiting area was Arthur's the other side of the north panel. She could see the chairs, the wall-mounted television running a weather segment with the sound off. People sitting. A man in a gray jacket. An older woman with her hands folded in her lap. 41 feet of soundproof glass between her and both of them. She counted the door. 1. Behind Preston, locked from the inside. Preston followed her eyes to the intercom panel on the east wall. "That's been disconnected since Tuesday," he said. His voice was even, conversational. The voice of a man who had planned for this specific moment and found it arriving exactly on schedule. "You're going to give me the copies," he said. "All of them, and then we're going to talk about what happens next." He took another step, 7 feet. Claire's right hand was at her side. The steel ring was on her middle finger, flat-banded, worn smooth on one edge, where her father used to press his thumb when he held her hand. She had worn it every day for 19 months. Since the funeral, she had never taken it off. Preston was 5 feet away now. "The copies," he said. "Where are they?" Not a question. Claire turned her body slightly, the small shift of someone adjusting their weight, and let her right hand rise to the glass. The ring touched the surface. Cold. Solid. A faint vibration she could feel all the way to her elbow. Her fingers remembered what her mind was too frightened to organize. Muscle memory 19 years deep. Her father's hand over hers at the kitchen table, again, until the rhythm lived below thought. 3 short taps, 3 long. Pause. 3 short. Then she stopped, waited 2 seconds, and tapped again, slower this time. Deliberate. A name, 7 beats. The name of the man who had locked this door and disconnected the intercom, and was now 4 feet from her face, believing he was the only person in this building who knew what was happening. Preston reached out and put his hand on her arm. "Stop that," he said. She didn't stop. In the waiting area 41 feet away through soundproof glass, Wade Calloway had gone completely still. The paper cup was in his hand. From the outside, he looked like a man who had simply stopped to think about something. But his eyes were on her hand, on the ring against the glass, on the pattern she was tapping. Something moved through him, not surprise, not urgency. Something older than both of those. A door opening in a part of his memory he had not opened in a very long time. He knew every beat of what she was sending. He set the paper cup down on the edge of the water fountain, reached into his jacket pocket, and made one call. He didn't say much, Hetty never did. 4 words. Then he hung up. "Stay with me." Because what happened in the next 40 minutes, nobody in that hospital has ever fully explained. Not the officers who arrived. Not the detective who filed the report. Not even Wade himself when people asked him later. To understand it, you have to go back. All the way back to the beginning. Claire grew up in Bridgeport, West Virginia. Her father's name was Gerald Bowman, Navy man. 8 years active service, communications division. He came home to Bridgeport when Claire was 3 years old with a bad knee, a collection of technical manuals he never threw away, and an absolute certainty that the most important thing he could give his daughter was the ability to clearly under pressure. He was not a loud man. He did not make speeches. He showed her things instead. Small skills, practical ones. The kind that don't announce themselves as lessons until years later when you need them, and they are simply there, already part of you. Claire's mother left when Claire was 7, not dramatically. Gerald sat across from his daughter at the kitchen table and said, in the same even voice he used for everything, "Your mother needed something different. That doesn't change anything about us." Claire didn't cry. She ate her cereal. Some people are built for leaving. Claire Bowman was built for staying. She studied nursing at West Virginia University, came back to Clarksburg because Mercy Ridge was the best trauma center within 40 miles, and because her father was still in Bridgeport, and she saw no reason to be far from him. The winter she turned 9, Gerald started teaching her Morse code. Not because he thought she would need it. He taught because it was his language. The one he had used in the dark, in the noise, in the places where every other form of communication had broken down. And sharing it with her was the closest thing he knew to giving her a piece of himself that would last. They practiced at the kitchen table after dinner, his knuckle tapping on the wood, her knuckle tapping back, short and long. Short and long. She learned faster than he expected. By the time she was 11, she was faster than he was. He laughed about that for years. "You're going to be dangerous one day," he told her. She tapped back. "I already am." Gerald had worn his steel ring since his Navy days. Plain, flat-banded, the kind of ring chosen for function, not appearance. After his stroke, when his hands were still relearning their precision, he took it off for the first time in over 20 years. On his last evening in the hospital, he held it out to Claire. She started to say no. He shook his head once. She took it. She had worn it every day since. He died 4 months after coming home. Not from the stroke. His heart simply stopped on a Tuesday night in February while he was reading in his chair by the window. Quietly, the way he had done most things. She drove to Bridgeport that morning in her scrubs. Sat in his chair by the window. Stayed for 3 days. Then she went back to work. Because that was what he had taught her. Grief was something you carried with you rather than something you stopped for. I need you to hold something in mind right now. The ring she tapped against that glass. It was not a tool she chose that night. It was something she had been carrying for 19 months without knowing why. Gerald Bowman gave his daughter a language he used in the dark. He had no idea which dark she would eventually need it for. She had been working the emergency ward for 2 years and 3 months when she pulled a patient chart that didn't match. A dosage discrepancy. She corrected it, flagged it, moved on. 2 days later, she saw the same pattern in a different chart, then a third. She was not an investigator. But she was Gerald Bowman's daughter, and Gerald Bowman had taught her to recognize when a number didn't belong in a column of numbers. These numbers did not belong. Someone had been diverting controlled substances from the hospital pharmacy, systematically, over 14 months. The author's signature on every anomalous order was the same, Preston Hale. She thought about saying nothing. She understood what saying something meant. Investigations, attorneys, her own name attached to an accusation against the chief of methamphetamine. Then she thought about her father. Some things you do because they're right, not because they're easy. Because they're right. She picked up the phone and called Dr. Patricia Shen. She did not know that Patricia had been covering for Preston Hale for 8 months. She did not know her call would be relayed within the hour. 6 days later, Roy Greer, her father's oldest friend, called and asked her to come have coffee. At his kitchen table in Bridgeport, he listened to everything without interrupting. Then he reached across the table, picked up her right hand and pressed something into her palm. The steel ring. He said, "Your father told me what taught you. He said if you were ever somewhere, you couldn't use your voice. Find glass. Find something solid that carries sound. and use the ring. Claire looked down at her closed hand. Roy said, "He also said you'd probably tell him you didn't need it." She almost smiled at that. She put the ring on. She did not think she would need it 4 days later. She was wrong about that. The morning it happened, Claire got to Mercy Ridge at 6:43. Donna Marsh was finishing her notes at the charge nurse station. Donna had been on this ward for 11 years and knew everything about everyone, and said 30% of what she knew. She looked up when Claire came in, held her eyes one beat longer than usual, then went back to her notes. Claire did not think about that extra beat until later. At 11:52, she saw the email. Sender, Office of the Chief of Medicine. Subject, Documentation Review. Required attendance. The meeting was scheduled for 9:45 that evening after shift change. Location, Observation Room B, 3rd floor. She read it twice, then a third time. Observation Room B was not an administrative space. It was a clinical monitoring room, glass on 3 sides. One door. An intercom panel that Preston had apparently disconnected 2 days earlier. A meeting after shift change. In a room with one door. She thought about not going. She thought about the nursing director. She thought about the number on the Wustbonchef Bar of Pharmacy website she had written on a notepad and not yet dialed. She thought about her father. Some things you do because they're right. She closed the chart. She went back to work. At 2:17 that afternoon, Wade Calloway parked his motorcycle in the visitor lot and walked through the main entrance. He was there for Jimmy Reese, the chapter's road sergeant, 6 weeks into inpatient rehabilitation, after a logging truck ran a red light on Route 50. Wade had been coming every other day. Not because anyone asked him to, because Jimmy had nobody else who came. He signed in at the nurse's station, walked to Jimmy's room, sat for an hour and 40 minutes talking about ordinary things. On his way out, he passed the family waiting area on the north end of the floor and stopped at the water fountain. He was not a man who examined his instincts, but there was another reason he stayed. One, he didn't talk about often. 12 years earlier, Wade had been sitting in a hospital, waiting in Charleston, when a woman 2 seats away had been trying to tell him something with her eyes for 20 minutes before he understood what he was looking at. By the time he understood, the man she was afraid of had already come back through the door. He had thought about that woman every day for 12 years. He was not going to walk past another waiting room and not look. He stood at the water fountain and did not leave. The afternoon moved slowly. The ward changed shifts. The corridor filled and emptied, and filled again. At 9:41, he watched Preston Hale come off the elevator, with his badge clipped to his coat and the particular walk of a man who had decided something, and was arriving to execute it. At 9:47, he watched Claire come through the stairwell door. She went through the observation room door. Preston followed her in. The lock turned from the inside. Wade's jaw tightened once. Then her hand came up to the glass. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. Every hair on his arm stood up. Then she kept going, slower, deliberate. A name tapped out beat by a woman who was running out of time and had decided to use what she had left. He knew the name by the 3rd beat. He already knew the face. He dialed. It rang once. 4 words, Mercy Ridge, 3rd floor. The water fountain hummed in the silence. Somewhere outside, the first engine turned over. Then another. Then more than he could count. Claire heard it before she understood what it was. A vibration coming up through the floor. Not mechanical. This had rhythm. This had intention. Preston heard it too. He stopped talking mid-sentence. Beyond the corridor windows that looked out over the south parking lot, headlights were moving in the dark. Not emergency lights. Headlights. Dozens of them. Moving slowly in formation. 22 motorcycles. They parked in 2 rows. Engines off, one by one, until the last one went quiet and the parking lot held a silence, somehow louder than the sound had been. Nobody got off their bikes. They just sat there. When Preston turned back to Claire, his face had changed. A hairline fracture in the certainty. The expression of a man who had planned carefully for one situation and was now standing inside a different one. Preston crossed the room and put his hand on her arm. Harder this time, and she understood this was the most dangerous moment. Not when he was certain. When he wasn't, the door handle moved, a single deliberate turn. Then a pause, then a knock, 3 times, unhurried. The knock came again. Same rhythm, same patience. Preston straightened his coat, unlocked the door, opened it 2 inches. Wade Calloway pushed it the rest of the way and walked in. He looked at Claire first. A single direct look that covered everything that needed to be covered. She was standing. She was upright. He looked at her arm where Preston's fingers had been. Then he looked at Preston. Wade Calloway did not yield space. He stood in the middle of the observation room, with the complete tiltness of a man who had not yet decided to do anything, which was somehow more unsettling than if he had. He looked at Preston the way you look at a problem you have already solved. You're just waiting for the problem to catch up. "Claire," Wade said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look away from Preston. "You can leave now." Preston said, "She's not going anywhere. We're in the middle of a." "Claire." Same volume, same tone. Claire pushed off from the monitoring console. Preston moved to block her. Wade took 1 step forward, not aggressive, not threatening. 1 step. The economy of it stopped Preston where he stood more effectively than any physical force could have. The room was very quiet. "I don't know who you think you are," Preston said, "but you are trespassing in a restricted area and interfering with a hospital administrative matter." "Preston Hale," Wade said. His voice was the same, level, unhurried, chief of medicine. "Mercy Ridge Medical Center. 14 months of diverted pharmacy orders. 47 requisitions. 1 authorizing signature." Preston went still. "That's a federal matter," Wade said, "not a hospital administrative matter." The silence that followed was the specific silence of a room in which something has just been named that cannot be unnamed. "You have no idea what you're talking about," Preston said. "Patricia Shen told you about Claire's call. Tuesday evening, 10:53. You pulled Claire's schedule Wednesday morning. You disconnected the intercom in this room. Tuesday maintenance log, 7:41 a.m. How do you?" "I made 4 phone calls," Wade said, "in the time it took you to walk from the elevator to this room." Claire stopped in the door frame and turned back. She needed to see it. The specific instant when a man who had built his safety on the belief that nobody was watching understood that somebody had been watching the whole time. Preston Hale understood it now. His shoulders changed. His hands moved slightly. An involuntary gesture, like a man reaching for something that wasn't there. He looked at Claire. She held his gaze. There was nothing to say. Everything that needed saying had already been said by a steel ring against a glass partition at 9:47 on a Thursday evening, 41 feet, away from a man who had been paying attention. From the corridor came footsteps moving quickly but without running. Donna Marsh appeared in the doorway, behind her. Detective Ray Sutter of the Clarksburg Police Department, badge clipped to his belt, a folder of documents under his arm, walking with the unhurried certainty of a man who had everything he needed. Preston looked at the folder. He looked at Wade. He looked at Claire one more time. He said, "I want my attorney." Wade nodded once. "That's the first reasonable thing you've said all night," he said. He stepped aside and let Detective Sutter through the door. Preston Hale was walked out of Mercy Ridge Medical Center at 10:23 that evening. Not through the back, through the main lobby, past the information desk and the row of chairs where people sat every day waiting for news about the people they loved. There were 11 people in those chairs. They watched Preston Hale walk through in his white coat. Badge still clipped, hands in front of him. And the lobby went the specific quiet of a room full of people processing something they did not expect to see. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. Later, in the break room, Donna Marsh told Claire, "I've been watching that man for 3 years. I knew something was wrong. I just didn't know what I was looking at." She paused. Then she said, "You knew what you were looking at," Claire said. "My father taught me." Donna nodded once. The specific nod of a woman who understood exactly what that meant. The investigation moved slowly, and then all at once. The West Virginia Board of Pharmacy opened a formal inquiry. The DEA arrived in the 3rd week, a distribution network moving diverted opioids through 3 counties, Mercy Ridge as one of several sources. Preston Hale was not the only name on the indictment. He was the most prominent. The preliminary hearing was held 6 weeks after the arrest. Claire sat in the 3rd row. Not because she had to. Because she had started something and believed that the people who start things have an obligation to witness where they end up. Preston entered in a gray suit. No white coat. No badge. He looked smaller than she remembered. Not physically. But something about a courtroom reduced him in a way the observation room hadn't. In the observation room, he had been on his own ground. Here, he was simply a man in a gray suit, waiting for a process he could not control. And then, as if he had felt her eyes, he turned. He found her in the third row. They looked at each other. Claire did not look away. Something moved across his face. Not defiance. Not blankness. The specific expression of a man who has arrived, after weeks of attorneys and hearings, and the slow, grinding machinery of consequence, at the place where the story he had been telling himself about who he was finally stopped working. He looked away first. Then he spoke. Not to his attorney. To her, quietly, 4 words, across the distance of a courtroom, in a voice that had lost everything that used to be in it. I knew it was wrong. That was all. Claire sat with those 4 words for a long time. She did not forgive Preston Hale, but she recognized what those words were. A man arriving, late and imperfectly, at the understanding that the harm he had caused was real, and that no title, no white coat, no architecture of justification had ever changed that. It was not enough. It was something. Wade Calloway came to the 3rd floor one more time, 3 weeks after the arrest. He came to see Jimmy, the way he always came. On his way out, he stopped at the charge nurse's station. He said, "How are you doing?" Not a performance. The plain question of a man who wanted a plain answer. She said, "I'm okay." "Getting there." He nodded. She said, "I don't know how to thank you." He said, "Your father taught you something that worked when you needed it to work. That's the thing that matters." She said, "Wade." He stopped. She said, "He would have liked you." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I would have liked him too." He walked down the corridor, past the water fountain where he had stood for hours holding a paper cup, thinking, the whole time, about a woman in a waiting room she and Charles Tull 12 years ago, and so decision he had made to never walk past as another one. The doors opened. He stepped in, and that was the last time Claire Bowman saw Wade Calloway. 4 months later, a new admit came up from emergency, 24 years old. A nurse from Morgantown who had been in a bad situation for a long time and had finally gotten out. Her name was Beth Carver, quiet, careful. The particular carefulness of someone who had learned to take up as little space possible and was not yet sure it was safe to stop. Claire brought her a cup of water, sat with her for a few minutes, and then, because she recognized something in Beth's eyes that she understood from the inside, she took off the steel ring and held it out. Claire said, "My father taught me something. I want to teach it to you." She tapped the ring against the bed rail. 3 short. 3 long. 3 short. She said, "If you're ever somewhere you can't use your voice, find something solid. Find glass, find metal, find anything that carries sound. And use this pattern." "Beth, what does it mean?" Claire said, "It means someone is listening." She pressed the ring into Beth's palm, closed her fingers around it, and held on for a moment, the way her father used to hold her hand at the kitchen table, steady and certain, in the space between one tap and the next. There is a question worth sitting with after a story like this one. How many times does a signal get sent and not received? Not because nobody was there, but because the person who was there hadn't learned the language, hadn't been taught to slow down long enough to hear it. Gerald Bowman understood something that most people spend their whole lives not quite arriving at. The most important thing you can give another person is not protection. You cannot always be there. You cannot stand between them and every locked door and every man who turns the lock from the inside. But you can give them a language, and you can teach the people around them to listen. That is the part that gets missed. Claire's ring against that glass was only half the equation. The other half was a man at a water fountain who had learned over 58 years that the signals people send when they have nothing else left are the most important signals in the world. Wade Calloway did not save Claire Bowman because he was extraordinary. He saved her because he stayed. Because when something snagged in him, that small, wordless instinct, he did not talk himself out of it. He thought about a woman in Charleston 12 years ago. He refilled his paper cup. He waited. He kept his eyes open. That is available to all of us. Pay attention to the people around you. Not every call for help is loud. If you or someone you know is in danger, the National Human Trafficking Hotline is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The number is 1-888-373-7888. Free, confidential. You do not have to be certain. You only have to make the call. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is available around the clock. The number is 1-800-799-7233. Free, confidential. Available by call or text. You don't have to figure it out alone. If this story stayed with you, tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one. And if you know someone who needs to hear this today, share it with them. Not for the numbers, for them. This is Heart Tales. Stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Because somewhere right now, someone is tapping. And someone else is learning to listen. 2 more stories are waiting for you on screen right now. Stay close.